Why were historians turned pale when they zoomed in on this 1887 wedding portrait? The basement archive of the Chicago Historical Museum smelled of old paper and dust, a scent that Dr. Rachel Thompson had grown to love over her 15 years as a curator. On this particular October morning in 2024, sunlight filtered weakly through the high windows, casting long shadows across rows of storage boxes waiting to be cataloged. Rachel sat at her workstation, methodically scanning photographs from a recent estate donation, her eyes tired but alert. The collection had belonged to the Patterson family, descendants of early Illinois settlers who had finally decided to part with their ancestral archives. Most of the photographs were predictable. Stern-faced ancestors in formal poses, faded images of farmland, a few Civil War soldiers standing rigidly before the camera. Rachel had processed dozens of similar collections, and she worked efficiently, noting dates and names in her database. Then she reached a photograph that made her pause. It was a wedding portrait, mounted on thick cardboard backing that had yellowed with age. The notation on the back, written in faded ink, read, "Thomas and Elizabeth Miller, June 14th, 1887, Riverside, Illinois." The image showed a young couple standing on the porch of a white clapboard house, surrounded by perhaps 20 guests arranged in careful rows. The bride wore a high-necked dress with delicate lace, her dark hair pulled back severely. The groom stood stiff and uncomfortable in a dark suit, his hand resting formally on her shoulder. Rachel placed the photograph on the scanner, setting it to the highest resolution. The museum's new equipment could capture details invisible to the naked eye, revealing textures and minutiae that often provided valuable historical context. She initiated the scan and waited, watching the blue light travel slowly across the image. When the digital file appeared on her screen, Rachel zoomed in habitually, examining faces and clothing. She noted the Victorian fashion, the wooden architecture typical of rural Illinois in the 1880s, the serious expressions expected of people who had to hold perfectly still for the long exposure times of early photography. Then she saw it. Behind the wedding party, the front door of the house stood partially open. Rachel zoomed in closer, her heart beginning to beat faster. There, carved into the wooden doorframe, barely visible, easily dismissed as a natural wood grain or shadow, was a symbol she recognized immediately from her graduate studies. It was a pattern used by the Underground Railroad, but that was impossible. The Underground Railroad had ceased operations in 1865 when the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished. This photograph was taken 22 years later. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she zoomed in further, her breath catching in her throat. Rachel leaned back in her chair, removing her glasses to rub her tired eyes. She had been staring at the symbol for nearly 20 minutes, cross-referencing it with images from her digital library of Underground Railroad markings. There was no doubt. The carving on the doorframe matched exactly the pattern known as the crossroads marker, a specific combination of lines and curves that had indicated a safe house where freedom seekers could find shelter, food, and guidance on their journey north. She enlarged the image until the pixels became visible, examining every detail of the carving. It was deliberate, carefully executed, not a random imperfection in the wood. Someone had carved it there intentionally, and the photographer had positioned the wedding party in such a way that the open door was visible in the frame. Rachel pulled up her notes on Riverside, Illinois. It was a small town about 15 miles west of Chicago, established in the 1850s by Presbyterian settlers who had strong abolitionist sympathies. During the Civil War era, several homes in Riverside had served as Underground Railroad stations. But by 1887, that network had been defunct for over 2 decades. The 13th Amendment had freed all enslaved people. The 14th had granted them citizenship. The 15th had given black men the right to vote. So why would anyone carve an Underground Railroad symbol on their doorframe in 1887? Rachel opened a new browser window and began searching for information about post-Reconstruction Illinois. What she found made her stomach tighten. After the hopeful years immediately following the Civil War, the 1880s had seen a dramatic rollback of civil rights gains across the country. In the South, Jim Crow laws were being enacted, creating a new form of racial oppression. But even in the North, conditions for black Americans were deteriorating. She found references to exploitative labor contracts, particularly in agricultural and railroad work. Black workers, many of them former slaves or their children, were being lured with promises of fair wages and good conditions, only to find themselves trapped in debt peonage, a system where employers provided advances on wages, housing, and supplies, then charged such high interest that workers could never pay off their debts. Legally, they couldn't leave until the debt was satisfied. In practice, it was a form of slavery by another name. Rachel sat back, a theory forming in her mind. Could the Millers have been helping people escape from these contracts? She needed more information about the couple in the photograph. The next morning, Rachel arrived at the museum with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. She had spent the previous evening researching everything she could find about Thomas and Elizabeth Miller, but online records from the 1880s were frustratingly sparse. She knew they had lived in Riverside, that they had married in June 1887, and that Thomas had worked as a photographer, a detail that made the deliberate framing of the doorway even more significant. She needed to find living descendants, people who might have family stories, letters, or documents that hadn't made it into official archives. Rachel called the Riverside Historical Society and spoke with a volunteer named Martha, an elderly woman whose family had lived in the area for generations. The Millers? Martha's voice crackled over the phone. Oh, yes, I know that name. There's a woman named Claire who lives over in Oak Park. She's a great-great-granddaughter, I believe. Lost her husband a few years back. She's been talking about donating some family papers to us, but hasn't gotten around to it yet. Rachel felt a surge of excitement. Would you have her contact information? I can give you her number, but she's a bit particular about strangers calling. Let me reach out to her first. Explain who you are. 2 days later, Rachel found herself driving through the tree-lined streets of Oak Park, a historic suburb west of Chicago, where Frank Lloyd Wright had designed many of the homes. Claire's house was a modest bungalow with a well-tended garden, chrysanthemums blooming in shades of rust and gold despite the late October chill. The woman who answered the door was in her 70s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that assessed Rachel carefully. Dr. Thompson? Come in. Martha said you had questions about my family. Inside, the house was warm and cluttered with the accumulation of a long life, bookshelves overflowing, framed photographs on every surface, stacks of papers on the dining room table. Claire led her to the living room and gestured to a worn sofa. Martha mentioned you found a wedding photograph of Thomas and Elizabeth, Claire said, settling into an armchair. I'd love to see it. I don't think I've ever seen their wedding portrait. Rachel opened her laptop and turned it toward Claire, showing her the high-resolution scan. The older woman leaned forward, studying the image with interest. That's their house, she said softly. It was torn down in the 1950s to make way for a strip mall, but I've seen sketches of it in family papers. And look at Elizabeth. She was beautiful, wasn't she? Claire, Rachel said carefully, I need to show you something in the photograph. Something unusual. She zoomed in on the doorframe, revealing the carved symbol. Claire's expression changed instantly, a flicker of recognition crossing her face before she carefully composed herself. You know what this is, Rachel said. It wasn't a question. Claire was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the symbol carved into the doorframe. Outside, a car drove past, the sound fading into the quiet suburban afternoon. Finally, she rose from her chair and walked to a large oak cabinet in the corner of the room. My grandmother told me stories, Claire said, opening a drawer and pulling out a worn leather portfolio. She was Thomas and Elizabeth's granddaughter. When I was young, maybe 10 or 11, she sat me down and told me things about our family that she said I needed to know, but that I should be careful about sharing. She returned to her chair, the portfolio resting on her lap. My grandmother said that Thomas and Elizabeth were part of something dangerous, that after the Civil War ended, they thought the fight for freedom was over, but they learned it had just changed shape. Rachel leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe. Claire opened the portfolio, revealing yellowed newspaper clippings, letters in faded ink, and several small photographs. Thomas was a photographer, as you probably know. He'd learned the trade during the war, documenting battles and soldiers. When he came back to Illinois, he opened a studio in Riverside. That's where he met Elizabeth. She worked for a Presbyterian minister who was involved in social reform work. She handed Rachel a letter, the paper brittle with age. This is from Elizabeth to her sister, dated 1889. Read it. Rachel carefully unfolded the letter. The handwriting was small and precise. Dearest Caroline, we helped another one escape last Tuesday. Thomas documented it, as always, though we must be more careful now. The railroad men are watching the stations more closely. Mr. Harrison came through and warned us that the company has hired men to track those who run. They call them criminals for breaking their contracts. But you and I know the truth. No contract signed under duress and deception is binding before God. We will continue as long as we are able. Rachel looked up, her hands shaking slightly. She's talking about the Underground Railroad symbol, but in 1889. Not the same Underground Railroad, Claire said quietly. A new one that helped black workers escape from labor contracts that were really just slavery with legal paperwork. She pulled out another document, this one an official-looking contract. Thomas kept this as evidence. It's from a railroad company in southern Illinois. Look at the terms. Rachel examined the document. It outlined wages, housing, and a signing bonus, all seemingly reasonable. But the fine print revealed the trap. Workers were charged for housing, food, tools, and medical care at rates that exceeded their wages. The debt accumulated weekly. The contract stipulated that workers couldn't leave until all debts were paid in full, and that attempting to leave would result in arrest for theft and fraud. It was legal slavery, Rachel whispered. Over the next 2 hours, Claire shared everything her grandmother had told her, supplemented by the documents in the leather portfolio. Thomas and Elizabeth, had been part of a small network of activists in Illinois who helped workers escape these exploitative contracts. They provided safe houses, false papers, money for train tickets north to Wisconsin or Michigan where the contracts weren't enforceable, and connections to sympathetic employers who would hire them without asking questions. The carved symbol on the doorframe wasn't random nostalgia. It was a working signal. In the 1880s and 1890s, people who knew the old codes would recognize it as a marker of safety. Thomas, as a photographer, had deliberately included it in the wedding portrait as documentation, a way of preserving evidence of their work. But why take the risk of putting it in a photograph? Rachel asked. Anyone could see it. Claire smiled sadly. Look at the photograph again. Really look at it. How long did it take you to notice the symbol? Rachel considered this. She had the benefit of high-resolution digital scanning and specific knowledge of Underground Railroad markers. To a casual observer in 1887, or even in 2024, the carved pattern would be nearly invisible, just another detail in the wood grain of an old house. Thomas was careful, Claire continued. He positioned people so the door would be visible, but not obvious. The symbol is there for those who know how to look for it. It's hidden in plain sight. Rachel examined the other photographs Claire showed her. Formal portraits, family gatherings, street scenes from Riverside in the 1880s and 1890s. In several of them, she could now spot subtle details, a specific flower in a lapel, a hand positioned in an unusual way, background elements that seemed innocent but carried coded meaning. Thomas documented everything, Claire said. It was his way of ensuring that if he and Elizabeth were caught, there would be evidence of why they did what they did, and evidence of the system they were fighting against. Were they ever caught? Rachel asked. Claire's expression darkened. Not exactly, but in 1891, something happened that forced them to stop. My grandmother didn't know all the details. She said Thomas and Elizabeth never spoke about it directly. But from what she pieced together from overheard conversations and fragments in letters, someone they were helping was captured. Not by the law, but by men hired by the railroad companies. She pulled out a newspaper clipping from August 1891. The headline read, Negro Vagrant Found Dead Near Riverside Station. The article was brief, dismissive, describing an unnamed black man found by the railroad tracks, presumed to be a drifter. No investigation was mentioned. My grandmother believed this man was someone Thomas and Elizabeth were trying to help escape, Claire said quietly, and she believed his death was not an accident. Rachel spent the following week immersed in research, barely sleeping. Claire had allowed her to photograph all the documents in the leather portfolio, and Rachel had begun cross-referencing them with newspaper archives, census records, and historical accounts of labor practices in late 19th century Illinois. The picture that emerged was darker than she had imagined. Between 1865 and 1900, thousands of black workers across the South and border states were trapped in a system that historians would later call debt peonage, or convict leasing. In the South, it was often enforced through explicitly racist laws. In the North, it took more subtle forms, predatory contracts, company stores with inflated prices, and legal systems that sided with employers over workers. Rachel found court records from Illinois in the 1880s, showing dozens of cases where black workers were sued for breach of contract and theft when they attempted to leave jobs where they were being exploited. The penalties were harsh: imprisonment, forced labor to pay off debts, or being returned to their employers under armed guard. What Thomas and Elizabeth had been doing was helping people escape the system, which meant they were, technically, helping people break legal contracts. If caught, they could have faced serious criminal charges, conspiracy, aiding fugitives, even theft, if they had provided money or resources to help people flee. Rachel knew she needed more than Claire's family stories and Thomas's photographs to prove this. She needed to find out what happened in 1891 and whether the death mentioned in that brief newspaper article was really connected to the Millers. She returned to the Riverside Historical Society, this time asking to see local newspapers from the summer and fall of 1891. Martha, the volunteer, helped her navigate the microfilm archives, and Rachel spent hours scrolling through grainy images of old newsprint. In late July, she found something. A small article buried on page 4 of the Riverside Gazette. Local photographer Thomas Miller has announced the temporary closure of his studio for personal reasons. Customers with pending orders are asked to contact Mr. Henry Wright at the Wright Photography Studio in Chicago for assistance. The timing was significant, just 2 weeks before the unnamed man was found dead near the railroad station. Rachel kept searching. In September, she found another brief mention. The residence of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Miller on Oak Street was the site of a small fire last Tuesday evening. Damage was confined to the back porch and was quickly extinguished by neighbors. The cause is under investigation, though sources suggest it may have been caused by an overturned lamp. Rachel sat back, her mind racing. A convenient fire, just weeks after Thomas closed his studio and a man connected to them died. It didn't feel like coincidence. She needed to know more about that death. She drove to the Cook County Archives in Chicago, requesting death records from August 1891. After 2 days of searching, she found it. An official death certificate for John Doe, colored approximately 30 years of age. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head. The examining physician had noted injuries consistent with fall from height or assault. No investigation mentioned, no follow-up. Just another black man dead, his life and death barely worth recording. Rachel knew she was onto something significant, but she needed more evidence to connect all the pieces. She returned to Claire's house with copies of the newspaper articles and the death certificate. The older woman listened carefully as Rachel explained what she had found. "I need to know if your grandmother ever mentioned specific names," Rachel said. "The man who died? Did she know who he was?" Claire was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of a photograph on her lap. "She mentioned a name once. Just once, and she made me promise never to repeat it. But I think it's time the truth came out." She took a deep breath. "His name was Marcus. That's all I know, just Marcus. My grandmother said he was young, maybe 25. He had been working on a railroad line being built through southern Illinois. The company had recruited him and about 30 other black men from Mississippi, promising good wages and fair treatment." "What happened?" Rachel asked gently. "The promises were lies. They were housed in camps, charged exorbitant prices for everything, and paid wages that barely covered their debts. When Marcus tried to leave, the foreman beat him and added the cost of his training and equipment to his debt. He was trapped." Claire's voice grew stronger. "Somehow, Marcus got word out to the Presbyterian Church Network. A minister in southern Illinois sent a message north, and it reached Elizabeth. Thomas traveled down to photograph the railroad construction. That was his cover. While he was there, he made contact with Marcus and several others, told them how to reach Riverside." "Marcus made it," Rachel said, understanding dawning. "He made it to their house. He stayed for 3 days while Thomas and Elizabeth arranged papers and a train ticket to Wisconsin, but someone had followed him or informed on him. Men came to the house, not police, but men hired by the railroad company. Thomas and Elizabeth said Marcus had already left, that they didn't know where he was going. The men searched the house but found nothing." Claire's hands trembled as she continued. "Marcus left that night. Thomas and Elizabeth thought he had gotten away safely. But 2 days later, his body was found by the tracks. My grandmother believed he was caught while trying to board the northbound train and killed as a warning to others who might try to escape." Rachel felt a chill run through her. And the fire at their house? A warning. The railroad companies had power, money, and connections. They couldn't prove Thomas and Elizabeth had helped Marcus, but they wanted to send a message. Stop interfering, or next time it won't just be a porch that burns. Did they stop? Claire looked down at the photographs spread across the table. For a while, they were terrified. But my grandmother said that by 1893, they were helping people again. More carefully, more secretly, but they couldn't just stand by while people suffered. Armed with Claire's testimony and the documents from the leather portfolio, Rachel began a systematic review of all of Thomas's photographs from the 1880s and 1890s. She requested access to other collections held by various Illinois historical societies, explaining that she was researching the work of Thomas Miller as part of a broader study of 19th century photography in the Midwest. What she discovered astonished her. Thomas had created an entire visual language of resistance hidden in plain sight within his commercial photography work. In a formal portrait of a Presbyterian minister from 1888, a book on the shelf behind him was positioned to show its spine. The Rights of Labor. In a photograph of a Riverside street scene from 1890, a building in the background had a window open at a specific angle. Rachel found a letter from Elizabeth mentioning that an open window at the northeast corner meant it was safe to approach the house. Most striking was a series of photographs Thomas had taken of railroad construction sites across Illinois between 1889 and 1895. Ostensibly, these were commercial commissions, documenting the expansion of the railroad network. But examining them closely, Rachel noticed that Thomas had carefully photographed not just the structures and machinery, but the workers and their living conditions. In one image from 1891, workers' barracks were visible in the background, ramshackle structures with no proper ventilation or sanitation. In another, men were shown working in dangerous conditions without safety equipment. Thomas had framed these images to look like simple documentary photography, but they were evidence, visual testimony to the exploitation that fueled America's industrial expansion. Rachel found something else. In several of the railroad photographs, workers' faces were clearly visible. This was unusual for the time. Typically, such photographs focused on the structures themselves, with workers appearing as anonymous figures. But Thomas had made sure to capture individual faces, preserving the humanity and identity of people whose names were rarely recorded in official documents. She cross-referenced these photographs with the letters and documents from Claire's portfolio. Several of the men whose faces Thomas had photographed in 1891 and 1892 were mentioned by name in Elizabeth's letters to her sister, Jacob, Samuel, Robert, identified as people who had passed through or found their way north. Thomas had been documenting the people he and Elizabeth helped, creating a visual record of their existence and their courage. And he had hidden this record in commercial photographs that no one at the time would have examined closely enough to understand their deeper meaning. Rachel realized she was looking at something unprecedented, a photographic archive of a secret network that had operated for at least a decade, helping dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people escape economic slavery in the years after the Civil War. As winter approached, Rachel worked late into the nights, assembling her findings into a comprehensive account. She had documented the existence of the post-Reconstruction escape network, traced the Millers' involvement through letters and coded photographs, and connected their work to the broader history of labor exploitation in late 19th century America. But one question still haunted her. Why had Thomas included the Underground Railroad symbol so prominently in the wedding photograph? It was more visible than any of the other coded elements she had found in his work. There had to be a reason. She returned to Claire one cold November afternoon, the wind stripping the last leaves from the oak trees lining the street. Claire welcomed her in, offering hot tea and settling into their now familiar positions in the living room. "I've been thinking about the wedding photograph," Rachel said. "Thomas was so careful in his other work to hide the evidence subtly. But that symbol on the doorframe, once you know what to look for, it's unmistakable. Why would he take that risk?" Claire smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "I was wondering when you would ask that. I think I know, but I wanted you to come to the question yourself." She pulled out a document Rachel hadn't seen before, a handwritten letter dated June 1887, the same month as the wedding. "This is from Thomas to his brother who lived in Ohio," Claire explained. "My grandmother kept it because she said it explained everything about who Thomas and Elizabeth were." Rachel read, "Dear William, by the time you receive this letter, Elizabeth and I will be married. I know you have expressed concerns about the work we do, the risks we take, but I want you to understand this marriage is not just a union of two people who love each other. It is a declaration of principle. When we stand before God and our community, we stand as people who believe that freedom is not something granted by law, but something inherent to every human soul. The door of our home will always be open to those who seek refuge. We mark it not with shame or secrecy, but with pride. Let those who have eyes to see, see. Let those who understand know where they can find help. We will not hide who we are." Rachel felt tears prick her eyes. The wedding photograph wasn't just documentation. It was a statement. "Exactly," Claire said softly. "Thomas and Elizabeth chose to include that symbol in their wedding portrait because they wanted to declare, publicly and permanently, what they stood for. They knew most people wouldn't notice it, but those who needed to see it, those who were searching for help, they would understand. And future generations, if they looked closely enough, would know the truth." Rachel thought about Marcus, the young man whose death had briefly silenced the Millers but not stopped them. She thought about the dozens of faces in Thomas's photographs, people whose names were forgotten by official history, but who had fought for their own freedom with every step they took northward. "What happened to Thomas and Elizabeth?" she asked. "How did their story end?" Claire stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. They lived into their 70s, both of them. They had 4 children, and by all accounts, they were loving parents and respected members of the community. Thomas's photography business thrived. He became known for his skill and his fairness in pricing, which made him popular with working-class families. She turned back to Rachel. They never spoke publicly about what they had done. The network they were part of gradually dissolved in the late 1890s, as legal reforms slowly improved conditions for workers, though not nearly enough or fast enough, but they never regretted it. My grandmother said Elizabeth told her, near the end of her life, that she and Thomas had simply done what their faith required. Welcome the stranger, shelter the vulnerable, stand against injustice. Rachel closed her laptop, feeling the weight of everything she had learned. "Claire, this story needs to be told, not just in an academic journal, but widely. People need to know that the fight for freedom didn't end in 1865, and that ordinary people like Thomas and Elizabeth risked everything to continue that fight." "I agree," Claire said firmly. "That's why I shared everything with you. My grandmother made me promise that if the right person ever came asking the right questions, I should tell them everything. I believe you're that person, Dr. Thompson." Well, harness it. Over the following months, Rachel worked with the Chicago Historical Museum to create an exhibition titled Hidden in Plain Sight, the Post-Reconstruction Underground Railroad in Illinois. The centerpiece was the 1887 wedding photograph, displayed on a large screen where visitors could zoom in and discover the symbol on the doorframe themselves, experiencing the same shock of recognition Rachel had felt. The exhibition included the documents from Claire's portfolio, enlargements of Thomas's railroad photographs showing the faces of the workers he had documented, and detailed explanations of the debt peonage system that had trapped thousands of black workers in the decades after emancipation. But Rachel insisted on something else, a wall dedicated to Marcus and the others who had risked everything to escape exploitation. Though most of their full names were lost to history, their faces, captured in Thomas's photographs, were displayed with dignity, each one captioned simply, Freedom Seeker, 1880s, 1890s. The exhibition opened in March 2025, on the anniversary of the passage of the 13th Amendment. Claire attended, now 81 years old, walking slowly through the galleries with Rachel at her side. They stopped before the wedding photograph, enlarged to fill an entire wall. They would be proud, Claire said quietly, looking at the faces of her great-great-grandparents, forever young in the photograph, standing before a door marked with a symbol of hope and resistance. They should be remembered, Rachel replied, not as heroes necessarily, but as people who saw injustice and chose to act, even when it was dangerous, even when the law was against them. That's a legacy worth preserving. Ciao. As visitors moved through the exhibition, many stopped before the wedding photograph, leaning in close to see the carved symbol for themselves. Rachel watched them, seeing their expressions change as they understood what they were looking at, a moment of ordinary happiness transformed into a declaration of extraordinary courage. The photograph Thomas had taken in June 1887 had finally revealed its deepest secret, not to condemn or shock, but to remind the world that freedom has always required vigilance, that justice has always demanded sacrifice, and that sometimes the most powerful resistance is hidden in the most ordinary moments, waiting patiently for someone to look close enough to see the truth. The door stood open in the photograph, just as Thomas and Elizabeth had kept their door open in life, a threshold between what was and what could be, marked with a symbol that meant, simply and powerfully, here you are safe, here you are welcome, here you are free.